Well, I think it's probably about time we start. It's 11:01. We've got a lot of people coming in. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you all. Welcome to Catering Contracts. I'm here with Andrew Fine, who's my partner and also runs our corporate group. And we do catering contracts all day long sometimes, especially now that we are heading into the season. I mean, take a step outside and you'll start to feel what we're feeling, which is holidays approaching. The weather's cooperating. People are starting to think about Thanksgiving and post-Thanksgiving and Christmas parties and holiday parties and New Year's Eve also. I know that our licensing team is going to send out an alert pretty soon about New Year's Eve permits. So look out for that. But today we're going to talk about catering contracts because, especially since COVID, things have changed pretty drastically. More people are signing up for catering events, whether they're off-site or in our PDRs. And we want to go through everything to make sure that A, you're making as much money as possible, and B, you're not getting screwed if somebody wants to cancel, and all the little things in between. So, Andrew, are you ready?
I am.
You're ready? Okay. And Alex, would you please put up the presentation? Thank you. All right. I'm David. That's Andrew. Here's our legal disclaimer. What we are about to tell you is not legal advice, so do not consider it legal advice. If you want legal advice, give us a call. Okay, that's it. Here we go. I'm ready. Approachability, don't leave it to lawyers to put two giant words on the first page of a presentation. Approachability versus enforceability. I can barely say it. But what does this mean, Andrew? When you're talking about approachability, why is this important and why did you lead off with this?
Yeah, so we lead off with this because there's very frequently a tension in catering and event agreements between, the lawyers wanting to protect you as our clients as much as we possibly can, right? By coming up with every contingency, every legal protection we possibly can. And what may start as a 2-page contract quickly becomes a 20 to 30-page contract. The upside there is every contingency is covered. You have insurance against every, possible bad situation that could happen. Everything's very clear. The downside is, when you're actually interacting with your own customers, presenting them with a 2-page contract is generally going to be a lot easier than presenting them with a 30-page contract. You don't want to intimidate guests. You don't want to intimidate or discourage people from signing with you if, the venue down the street is only giving them a 1-pager that's easier to digest. So we as lawyers have grappled with this, trying to figure out, what is a good length? How do we get all the protections in there that we need without that intimidation factor? And what we have started to do with increasing frequency is, for catering and event agreements, we'll have a cover page outlining all the terms that your customers are actually going to care about, right? The date of the event, guaranteed guest count, all of the fee structures and the deadlines, the dates, all of the pertinent information they're going to care about. And we'll follow that up with the terms and conditions that follow after the fact, right?
Hold on, let me stop you there. So our contract might be 4 or 5 pages long because we do have to cover a lot of stuff. But, we're also in the business of sales. We're salespeople. So when somebody comes to us and says, I want to rent your PDR, or I want to have a party at my house or wherever, you don't want to be like, okay, great, no problem. Here's our 6-page legal document. So you give them that cover page because it helps with the sale. And it also helps them understand what they really need to know. So if nothing goes wrong, they'd never even have to look at that contract, right?
That's exactly it. Yep. So, where contracts tend to become intimidating is if you have to go through 4 paragraphs of legalese to even get to the point where you disclose what they're obligated to pay and when, right? So if you give them all the commercial points at the front, it's up to them, right, to decide, all right, so how deeply do I want to dig into the terms and conditions for things like, if I cancel, what happens? They're free to do that. We try to make that as clear and as intelligible as possible in the terms and conditions. But you're at least able to get a sense of what the contract really is at its core by starting with that cover page. It also lets you do things like, you can put your logo and your heading on the cover page and make it look nice, as opposed to terms and conditions, which everybody's, familiar with kind of breezing through, your various tech and Apple contracts. Everybody knows the terms and conditions are going to be a little lengthy, have some boilerplate language, but that's not going to distract from the terms that you're actually more likely to be negotiating, right, with your customers, like price, dates,
Take us
purposes.
through. Can you like rapid fire bullet point what that cover sheet looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. You're going to have, the date of the contract, the date of the event in question, right? Whether you're hosting it, whether it's somewhere else. So you have the date, the location, the guest count. You might make reference to the menu and attach a menu at the end of it, but just explain, if you're catering, what are you catering? And then fees. Is there a deposit? Is it non-refundable? If there are installments, when they're due? Everything dollars and cents wise, right, would really go into that, even down to if you have overtime fees, if there's a cancellation fee, you might put that in there. Everything that you're going to end up charging a client would end up more often than not in that cover sheet.
That makes sense. I do want to let everyone who is watching the webinar let you know that you can feel free to ask questions during the presentation, during the webinar. Just put it into the chat box. I'll be looking at them. And if I love your question, I will ask it to Andrew. Okay. Anything else you want to say about the ease of which you should sell your business? I mean, sell your event versus how you need to enforce it?
I think we've covered a lot of it. I like to start here because we'll get into, suggested language about contingencies and all of these things. And I've had enough conversations with clients to know that the very understandable concern that clients have is the more we say, oh, you should have this in your contract, you're that in your contract, the back of people's minds are thinking, man, how long is this thing going to be? Right. And I don't want to scare people off. Is this necessary? Is this not? So knowing that you can talk about what's going to be important to customers on the front, literally the front page of your contract, and follow with terms and conditions that are going to be, more legalese in nature, hopefully alleviates some of that worry of, oh man, this seems a little intense. Is this in their contract or not? The answer is yes. All the big players have basically everything that we're going to be talking about in their contracts, but you wouldn't necessarily know it because they don't feature it on the very front page. It's in a terms and conditions that governs ultimately the contract that you're presenting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. So we're starting our contract off with a nice juicy contract underneath a cover page that gives you the basics. Alex, let's go to the next slide. Very demanding, Andrew. Be specific. Demanding. Be specific. When you say be specific, I assume that you are referring to all the things in the right-hand column of this. Do you want to take us through? So the who, what, when, and where, that's pretty self-explanatory. Anything we need to know about that's out of the ordinary?
Yeah, I think a lot of this is, as you said, self-explanatory, but you'd be surprised. A lot of times we get involved with catering or event contract disputes after the fact, right? And they say, oh, well, the clients had ridiculous demands and now they want to cancel, and we'll dig into the facts. And often what happens is, there are a lot of emails or calls talking about the event, but you look at the four corners of the contract and it doesn't have any of that in there. And if you don't have the expectations of both sides kind of laid out very specifically in the contract, it's very hard to enforce those expectations against the client, right? So what ends up happening is, if the contract isn't specific and you don't get paid, our ability to recover that payment for you really depends on how clear the contract is. So thinking about, being as specific as possible so that somebody, your hypothetical judge, not that we would ever want to take this all the way to a litigation, but you're always thinking about your leverage in these situations. Think about what a hypothetical judge would be able to glean from that contract. The judge doesn't understand what kind of arrangement this is. It's going to be very hard for the judge to land on your side of things. Another thing to remember is because you as the host or the caterer are going to be presenting this contract to your customer, the default legal rule is ambiguity in a contract is construed against you as the drafting party. So if there is any ambiguity or if something's not clear, a savvy customer is going to use that to their advantage and say, oh, well, you didn't specify that, so I'm not going to pay you, or I'm not going to do what you need me to do. And it's hard to combat that, as frustrating and unfair as that outcome may be. It's always good to be as specific as possible in the contract, and leave nothing to chance, leave nothing to interpretation. And remember that in a contract, it almost doesn't matter what you might say via text or via email, or the clarifying things you come up with after the fact. The more you can put in writing in the contract that's actually being signed, the better your odds are of being ultimately protected if something, bad or unexpected happens.
Okay, so who, what, when, and where is, we don't have to go into that unless there's something special you want to say about it. The type of event, when you say the type of event, don't we always know what type of event we're doing? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the type of event can change. Like, customers might say, hey, I want you to cater an office party. And, you make adjustments appropriately. And then all of a sudden they're like, actually, you know what? The office party fell through. I now want you to cater a wedding, but can we keep the contract exactly the same? That might not be possible. There might be certain considerations for a type of event that don't really apply to another type of event. So when you're catering an event, it's good to know not only the who, what, where, and what, but what is the celebration, right? Is this a wedding that's going to probably have different considerations for a caterer than if this is a corporate event, versus if this is just a birthday, versus if
Clearly. Okay.
Yeah.
And when you say attach sample menus, is there language that you have to put on the sample menu? I know I've done enough catering in my life to see menus, and then the actual menu is totally different. What's the point of attaching a sample menu? Why not just go right to the menu that you're going to provide?
If it depends on how ready you are to do that. If you know the menu in advance, absolutely say, hey, here's the menu that we are catering. Oftentimes, these are signed so far in advance that you kind of finalize the menu as you go. And one of the pitfalls that we see is, because the menu is not 100% finalized at signing, you don't attach anything and you don't mention the menu, and you say, oh, we'll figure this out as we go. But if all of a sudden, the expectations of your customer radically change over the course of those 6 months, you want to at least have some kind of sample menu to say, look, this might not be the final menu you're preparing or providing at the date of the event, but it's going to be substantially similar to this. So they can't say, hey, I'm, hiring you, to serve Mexican cuisine, and all of a sudden say, actually, we want to do French, right? It's like, if you don't have an understanding in the initial contract of what the initial expectation was, it's hard to resist and to deny those pivots and expectations for the clients down the road.
Well, that's good. So you can even just put type of cuisine would be important. And then the sample menu. Tell me about, so anticipated guest count's always interesting, because obviously we want to charge per person. And so if I'm a caterer, I'm a restaurant owner, and someone says, I want to do a party for 100, I'm putting in 100. How do I deal with, even if 90 people show up or 110 people show up?
Yeah, so the reason you require an anticipated guest count is, theoretically, your total price that you're charging assumes that number of guests. And you never want to be in a position where one of your customers asks for a refund. If they say they're going to be 100 people and there winds up being 95, chances are that doesn't really save you any money, right? Because if you don't know the total guest count, you're ordering the inventory, you're staffing up the same way either way. So
Right.
Basically, what you want the contract to say is, we are going to be prepared, staffed, and able to, either cater for or host the number of people you say in this contract, regardless of the number of people who come, if it's lower, right? So this is the amount you're paying. It doesn't matter if, your aunt or uncle gets sick and they don't show up. You're charging that same amount because that's what you're prepared to do. So you set that as a minimum amount of money that you're charging. The flip side of that is, you also want to say, if they do add more people at the last minute, put parameters on whether they can do that at all, right? You don't want them saying, hey, there are 100 people, and the day before, oh, actually, we have another 50, right? You want the required guest count to say, look, this is the number of people we're prepared for. If they add more, you can decide what's the variance that you're allowing, right? Can they add people at the last minute, yes or no? That kind of depends on your ability to meet those demands. You might want to put limitations on how much advance notice you need for those changes. And also
in the contracts, So let's say it's 106 people show up. In the contract, are you saying how much it costs per person?
Well, if the total number of guests exceed what the contract says, you might consider putting an additional per head charge on additional guests.
Right.
If you're able to cater for them, right? We've had situations where caterers say, look, we're ordering inventory in advance. If you add 10 more people, we're just not going to have plates for them. So you have to consider whether it's even feasible. You don't want to say, oh, we'll charge you per head an additional cost if you're not actually able to do that. So I might say, look, your total guest count may vary by 10%, up to 10%. And if so, we'll charge you a per head, charge. But it really depends on how nimble you can be and how quickly you can adapt to those changes. If you can adapt to those changes, make sure you bill for them. But if you can't, make sure it's clear to them. If they add more people, great, that they're just not going to have plates.
Okay. Setup and breakdown. What do you mean by that? Do you mean you want us to explain to the client how, when, where we're going to set up, how long it's going to take, when we need access, that kind of thing?
Exactly. Everything you just said. A lot of contracts, particularly for events, will have, the time the event starts in the context of when do guests arrive. But you as the host or you as the caterer probably need to get there beforehand. So you want to clarify, if you're catering a third-party event, when are you getting there versus when are the guests getting there? Do you have access? Are you going to have to call them and say, hey, the front gate is locked, can I get in? Right? Like, coordinating those logistics ahead of time tends to save a lot of headache. So with event time, there's often the setup time, the event start time, the event end time, and the breakdown time. So instead of just having a start and end, you're kind of putting different bookmarks on it, so that you can clarify, hey, I'm definitely going to have access to this space for a certain period of time. We've seen situations where, caterers will sign contracts and, the event will say, all right, great, everybody out by midnight. But obviously, if you're catering, you need time after that to take stuff away. If the venue's kicking you out at the same time they're kicking guests out, that's a huge problem because you need that extra time. So it kind of makes clients think about, wait a minute, okay, if I'm getting kicked out, everybody's getting kicked out at midnight, maybe my event has to end at 11:30 to give, my vendors enough time to give them that buffer to actually break things down and to get out so that we can comply with the venue's rules.
Yeah, you're dealing with a lot of traffic as the caterer. You've got other vendors coming in, you've got the facility itself, you've got your client, etc. When you say consider all fees, and more on this later, do you want to just talk about it later, or what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about a lot of, contingencies with, any additional fees for guests beyond what they disclose. But, if they ask you to stay late, there should be an overtime fee. We'll get into those more because we have slides dedicated specifically to fees. But in the spirit of specificity, really think about, if there are additional fees that you're charging, make sure those are included in your cover page. Don't bury them, because that tends to be where disputes arise. It's like, oh, I didn't know that this fee existed. And you don't want to say, oh, it was on page 47. How did you not see that? Right? If there are contingent fees, try your best to make those pretty readily apparent to your customers and to your clients on that cover page if you can fit them in.
And you should also probably talk about, I don't know if you're planning on this, but we have a case in-house now, a high-end restaurant did a catering event, and it was an open bar up to a certain level, and the customers started to drink a lot more and started to order very, very expensive glasses of alcohol. So much so that it was $20,000 or $30,000 more than they expected. We had in the contract, or they had in the contract, that there was a person who could authorize expenditures over what they had originally contracted for, and thankfully they did that, because the next day the client just disputed it because they couldn't believe how expensive it was, even though they were told how expensive, and approved it. So they may have had some drinks and not remembered, but that's not our fault, is it? So you got to think about stuff like that. Alex, let's go to the next one. Exclusivity. You think that when you say exclusivity, you mean when a caterer is doing a job at another location, right?
Yeah, it's even broader than that. You could be hosting an event, but you want to make sure, if you're hosting an event at a restaurant, you're not going to have some third party show up on the day of and be like, oh, hey, I'm here to serve ice cream, right? You want to
Right.
make sure you know who the parties are. And if a lot of our clients, make the understandable mistake of assuming if they're being hired to cater a party, that they're the only caterer, right? It's amazing to me sometimes how many times clients will hire numerous caterers, and all those caterers assume they're the only ones, right? But at the end of the day, everybody gets there and it's like a madhouse, right? There's not enough space for all of them. They're all competing over the same resource, same space, and bumping into each other, and it's kind of chaotic. So if you are hired to cater an event, make sure that you either specify that you're the exclusive caterer, or if you're working with others, understand what they're doing and how you're expected to work with them, right? If you're showing up and they're saying, oh yeah, you have use of this kitchen, great. Are you the only one with use of that kitchen? So just consider that, because we've seen a lot of clients run into trouble there. And just, it's not that they can't perform, it just makes the day a lot more hectic and a lot less enjoyable if you're ultimately bumping elbows with people you didn't expect to be there.
How specific do you think clients should get when they are talking about the space that they use? The example you gave is another vendor comes in and there's a kitchen issue. When we're doing contracts like this, are we asking the venue or the person what kind of refrigeration space we have, what kind of space we have for setup, tell me what kind of things we think about.
Depends on the scale of the event, right? If you're catering a high-end wedding and you're depending on the venue supplying you with, things like a kitchen, prep space, right? If you're sharing staff with the venue, we get very, very specific there, to the point where we'll sometimes ask for floor plans, right? And exact specifications for, what kind of equipment are you being supplied with versus what are you expected to bring yourself? And we'll usually do that through exhibits. We'll say, here's what the venue is responsible for, exhibit A, here's what we're responsible for, exhibit B. And that often, depending on the scope of that, you may want to add the venue as a party to that contract, because if ultimately the venue doesn't supply it, you probably can't logically go after, you could contractually, but logically wouldn't make sense to go after, the grandmother who's just trying to put an event together for her friends, right? You really want to go after the venue for misrepresenting something. So depending on how much you're relying on a venue as a caterer, you might want to bring them into the contract if you're really relying on them for really critical things like kitchen space.
Interesting. Okay. Alex, let's go to the next one, please. Event fees, exclamation point. Let's talk about fees. Obviously, it matters. This is why we're doing these these catering gigs. When you say disclose all fees up front, including a contingent fee, what fees are you talking about, and what do you mean by a contingent fee?
Yeah, so contingent fees are fees like overtime fees, right? Fees for additional guests, anything that isn't necessarily expected to be charged up front, but if events change or the specifications change, you want to make sure that if there's any chance of price increases, you're going to disclose that up front and specify exactly how much that price will increase. Ideally, you're disclosing the fees you're paying as a total amount, and then you're breaking it down from there, right? You want to generally require a deposit up front that's non-refundable, just to reserve the time. And then usually the way it works is you charge the remainder of that total fee in installments, so that
let me ask you a question about the deposit. So you say 20 to 30%. That sounds about right. What kind of policies do we put in place? And you also said it was non-refundable. Is that true? Is it totally non-refundable? If I'm booking out a gig, I don't know, a year in advance, and then somebody wants to cancel in 8 months beforehand, are you telling me that the security deposit is non-refundable?
It depends. We'll get into this in a little while with termination fees, but generally the public policy position here is the amount of cost you can impose on a client for canceling depends on how much you're actually burdened by that. If you sign an event contract 3 years out and they cancel 2.5 years out, chances are you can rebook that date and you haven't really spent too much money in reliance of that date. Now, sometimes you have, right? If it's a custom menu and you're going through the process of really putting customized programs together that far out, you're much more justified in not refunding that deposit. If the deposit is an advance on work you're doing in advance, great. But if it's more of a cookie cutter, like, yeah, we'll cater your event, we'll worry about that a week beforehand, you're probably going to refund the deposit or some or all of it, depending on when that cancellation happens and how much work you've spent in specific reliance of that.
So is our default that the deposit is non-refundable?
Our default is what is refundable and what is charged is a product of when the cancellation happens. But again, every contract is a little different. If you're a caterer, it's a little different than if you're a host of the space yourself. It really depends on what you're putting together for the client and when you start work on that, right? When you start, putting that together. It's also going to depend on how likely you are to rebook. We have certain clients who, cater specifically to certain types of events, and they book up years and years in advance. So if somebody cancels 6 months out, the odds that you're going to fill that slot with another private event might be lower than another business where 6 months is plenty of time to fill it.
Yeah,
so,
I got that. When you say consider payment by, I understand that about security deposit, but I think usually we like to just say it's non-refundable because there's an amount of time that it takes to get the gig booked, meaning meeting with people, going over menus. You know how clients are. You can meet with them 6 times before they decide to sign a contract, and that might have been 6 hours of your time. So you can certainly account for that. And then, of course, thinking about the menu, putting a schedule together, and all the other things we have to do. When you say consider payment by installments, I think a lot of people get hung up on this also. So we're talking about 20 to 30% upfront in a non-refundable deposit. What are the other? How many more payments along the way? Is there one more payment and then final payment, or do you go right to final payment? And talk about the timing of when we should be getting those payments.
This can vary a lot. It really depends on the scale of the event and how much you're required to deliver. If there is this timeline where, for example, contract might say a final menu has to be presented and approved within a certain amount of time, that's a perfect example for when another installment's due. The reason you want as many installments as possible is to make sure that you're getting paid for the work that you're doing as you go. Because ultimately, if they're not going to pay you, chances are they're not going to pay you on those installments. So you don't want to do all this work up front with the understanding it's like, it's okay, I'll get paid on the event date and then not get paid on the event date. If you have a deposit up front of 20%, but the remaining 80% is paid all at once, the risk of non-payment then becomes a lot higher, right? As opposed to if you have installments before that and somebody doesn't pay, you can say, look, it's pencils down on my part. I'm not moving forward with this contract unless you pay this installment. It's a way to kind
of. What's the second? First payment is on the contract. Is the second payment when we finish the menu, or is it an amount of time before the event?
It depends. It really depends. We've seen usually there are 2 or 3 installments. Sometimes it's with 6 months before you get another installment. Sometimes it's 2 months before. It really depends on your business model and the timeline for these. Some people sign event contracts a month in advance. Some people sign it 3 years in advance. So the installment schedule is going to be very dependent on how much time exists between signing and the event date. Chances are the larger events are signed further out from the event to give you more time. So it really depends. We as lawyers are always looking for creative excuses to charge installments up front, right? So if there are any deliverables, that's a perfect excuse to say, all right, that's going to be an installment. If you don't have deliverables, if you have the menu in advance, then it's just by time, right? If it's 6 months out, maybe you do installments, every 2 months, then 3 installments, 2 months out. It's hard to put a standardized curve on that because it really depends on the factors. But I think philosophically, it's just good to understand why we as lawyers like to find excuses for installments because it reduces the risk that you're going to be left holding the bag at the end of an event.
Yeah, people like to cancel things. We know that from the amount of no-shows we see in the industry. What's an overtime fee? So you book an event that's supposed to run until midnight, and the host comes over and says, "Can you please stay another hour?" How do you do it? Do you do it by the hour? Do you do it? Is there another method of figuring out how much to charge?
In terms of how much to charge, I would just think about, what your actual costs are, right? If you're paying people hourly, you generally have a good sense of here's what my staffing costs are. Because chances are if an event goes overtime, it's not like, the food is the food. You've already supplied that. The additional cost is really going to be in the form of time. So you have to think about, what is the additional cost that I have to pay as a host or as a caterer to my people if they have to stay late. Chances are, I have to, if someone's hourly or if somebody's getting paid for a certain event, for a certain fixed period of time, you have to calculate, okay, what would I be out of pocket? And then impose at least that amount on the client for any overtime. I wouldn't necessarily do it by the hour. I would do it by the half hour.
When do you collect those? So host comes over and they say, "Hey, this is amazing. We want another hour." You know it's going to be $2,500. Do we have a credit card on file? How do we protect ourselves there?
Ideally, you collect that information and you just run an automatic charge at the end of the month or at the end of the event. And you send them a final invoice. The reason that we always say be specific is if you clearly state in the contract that's signed up front what the overtime fees are, you can just charge them, right? Because theoretically the client's on notice of them. If they want you to go over, great, that's just an automatic charge. They don't need to sign anything. There's really no negotiation because it's already there.
Got you.
And having the automatic payment is nice. It's tough if you have to collect checks or because I'm seeing a comment here from Matthew, and it's a good question. Chasing somebody down at the end of an event, chances are people are intoxicated or just not in the mood to think about, oh yeah, I owe you a check. Collecting credit card information and just having the payments at the day of the event be automatic, either that night or the day following the event, is very helpful. And you can do that as long as the fees are disclosed very clearly up front, because you're just charging what they've already committed to pay.
Can you charge? I mean, I would want to run the card before the event, so they didn't have a chance to somehow, I don't know, change their information or something else. I know that sounds paranoid, but I've seen it happen.
It depends on what you can negotiate, right? If you say, look, we're gonna get the full amount 7 days before the event, you could probably do that. It's less common. Clients generally don't like that because they say, well, I'm paying you and you could just walk off the job or you could not show up and then I have to recover from you, right? So you're shifting the risk onto the client, and it depends on what the client's comfortable with. Usually paying in installments and having, the remainder payable at the end is a good compromise because the client, feels okay saying, all right, well, you're not getting your full amount until you actually show up and do what you say you're going to do. But on the host or the caterer side, you're getting, chunks of the total amount. So if the client doesn't show up, you at least, not left holding 100% of the bag.
What are late fees?
Late fees are if they don't pay you in time, right? If your installments due, 6 months out and they pay you 5 months out, you should charge a late fee for the fact that they didn't pay you on time. It's usually somewhere between 5 and 8% is a standard late fee. And in addition to that, you want to reserve the right to again terminate the contract if they're not paying you.
Right. Here's a question for you. Do you suggest hourly plus a suggested gratuity?
I'm not sure. I'm looking at the comment now. Do I suggest hourly?
So someone wants to go overtime. Do we, or even not overtime? Are we always throwing in the gratuity? Is that part of the contract? It's going to be $10,000 plus a 22% gratuity or something?
Yeah, the gratuity is usually a product of the total cost, right? So if you're saying overtime is going to be X, then the contract would be written to say, here's the total contract price. It may be subject to increase, and the gratuity is going to be a percentage of the total, right? So the gratuity is usually calculated after the fact. You disclose if you are charging a gratuity, you have to make it really clear what that percentage is and what it's a product of.
And make sure you give that money to the wait staff, please. I've seen people get into trouble with taking parts of that for themselves. Admin fees are different. If for an offsite job, how would an admin fee be added to the check for both offsite and drop off? So
Yeah, good.
yeah, there's always admin work to do. Is that included in the general cost, or do you see people adding admin fees separately?
Admin fees are usually separate. Usually the admin fee is fixed. If you want to make it a percentage, you can. And the problem with the percentage is you don't necessarily know what that total amount is, right? If there are late fees, if somebody goes overtime, the total admin fee that you're charging is going to be slightly different. It's always to say, hey, here is the admin fee. Here's what it is up front, and make it a fixed amount. If you want to make it a percentage, you can, but just understand that that's going to be variable. Any fees that you're charging that are a percentage of a total, you want to not only disclose how you're calculating that very, very clearly up front, but you want to send them an invoice after the fact to say, hey, here's the fees we charge you. Here's how we calculated it. Based on
Here's another question from Christina. What is a reasonable time frame for final payment post the event? 1 week or the first following business day?
I think the day following is fine.
Hell yeah, right away.
Wait. Yeah.
Never wait a week. People change their minds and they start to recall things a little bit differently. So yeah, next day, please. Okay, another question. Regarding the admin fee, what if you end up working a lot more on the contract than expected and you had a fixed fee?
Well, if you have a fixed fee, remember, we're going to have a separate overtime fee. So if you work more than expected and the event itself is longer, you can charge an overtime fee based on the amount of time you
I
spend.
think they're talking about administratively. The person's this huge pain in the neck. They call you 25 times a day. They want to change the menu every other day. What do? Just go back and change the contract and say, look, you're killing me with the calls. I got to charge an extra $5,000 or whatever, $2,000.
I mean, it's tough, right? If you commit to an admin fee, you're kind of stuck with it. You got to make sure that if you're charging an admin fee, it's an average of the amount of time you're spending. You might be overcharging some clients and undercharging others. You have to be wary when you price things of those outliers. A way to protect yourself against a client who takes advantage is to say, look, this is an admin fee. Here's what it includes. Here's the number of hours we will devote, right? And in excess of that is going to be billed hourly at that rate. It kind of all feeds into the general trend of this webinar, which is to be very, very specific. You never want to be in a situation where you're saying, look, I know I said the admin fee was going to be this, but it turns out I actually spent a lot more time on this. So can I charge more? Of course, the client's going to say no, right? Like you committed to this fee. It's not my problem that, ultimately you wound up losing money on this. If you charge a fixed fee, it's kind of tough love. You're stuck with it.
Architects oftentimes and other professionals put in a scope of work and they'll say, like, I'll give you X number of revisions. Do we ever see clients do that for menus? Like, okay, here's a menu. We'll come up with a menu. You have 2 revisions that you can make up until this time, or else we're going to charge you a fee. You ever see that?
With menus, it's a little different, right? Because ultimately, you don't want clients to feel like they can dictate the menu, right? They have input over the menu, but they could give you 2 revisions and you could deny all of them to say, sorry, we just don't prepare this dish, or sorry, that's not possible, or sorry, this, we priced this assuming the menu that we had attached here. That's why attaching either the final menu or at least a sample menu in advance is helpful. We don't generally give clients, we don't put language in there saying clients have a certain number of revisions, because it implies you're going to honor those revisions. We can say give input, but that's about it. And at some point, it's your prerogative to say, look, this menu is fine. I'll take it or leave it.
Gotcha. Okay. Well done. Alex, let's go to the next one, please. Termination. Scary. When you're saying termination, you're meaning that either side, for some reason, wants to end the contract, right?
Yeah, I mean, more often than not, it's going to be the client canceling on you. You want to make sure, if you have an exit right, we can talk about what that looks like. But most of the time when we're drafting contracts, we're really trying to protect you against a client either saying, look, this event isn't happening anymore, give me all my money back, or a situation where they said, actually, this date doesn't work anymore, I want to change it. right? One of the things we want to impress is that a termination could be any adjustment of the material terms of the contract that you can't abide by, right? We've seen a lot of situations where customers feel very entitled to have you cater and say, oh, I know we signed the agreement for this date, can't do this date anymore, now you have to do this one. Technically, they're breaching the contract by saying, nope, I'm not honoring the contract as we signed it, right? So if they're doing that, you have a choice between honoring the new date, and a lot of times people do just to build goodwill, and they recognize, look, if I don't honor this new date, I'm probably not getting fully paid for this event, so I'll honor the new date. Or if they try to, do this a number of times and they're constantly changing things on you, you can say, you know what, I'm not obligated to honor this, right? And ultimately you stick to the agreement as we originally had it, or you are terminating this contract, and I get to keep some or all the amounts that you pay, depending on what that termination fee schedule is.
Okay, so for non-payment, obviously we're going to terminate. Someone they paid us a deposit, and then round 2 comes up, we finish the menu, we're a month out, and we've asked them for payment, and now they're a week late, and they're just not paying us. What do we do?
If they're not paying, if the client has not paid you, you have a right to terminate generally in the way we structure contracts for breach, right? We often don't have a convenience termination as the host or as a caterer. We're committed to doing this unless there's some kind of, supervening supernatural event that prevents us from doing it. But we can say, look, if you're breaching your side of the deal, we can terminate. And you still owe all amounts that are owed up until that point.
How likely is it, and this goes back to why you should collect as many fees up front as possible, if somebody terminates and they haven't paid us all of the amounts that are due, it's going to be kind of hard to collect that second payment, isn't it?
Very hard. And that's why you generally want to collect installments over time, because it's not a question of what you need to collect from them. It's a question of what you're obligated to refund to the client. Now, remember that there are specific statutes governing what you can charge as a penalty for termination. And basically what the statutes say, every jurisdiction has a slightly different variation of this, but particularly for catering agreements, the statutes say you can only charge a penalty that aligns with the costs you incur, right? So that if you're charging installments, you got to think about what installments make sense to charge based on the work that you are actually spending, right? If it's an hourly fee, if it's time you spent obtaining inventory and preparing for the event, make sure that the termination fee scales. Again, it's not really going to be easy or even necessarily allowed to charge 100% of the total contract fee if they terminate a year out, because chances are you haven't really suffered those damages. But if they cancel the day before, absolutely. So that's why, when we're talking about termination fees, David, you're right. Sometimes it's just a question of what you're obligated to refund. But that's why coming up with an installment schedule and having that be reflective of here's the actual time and costs we're incurring at these various stages, it works both ways, right? As both making sure you're covered in the event of cancellation and also making sure you're not collecting from them in that event. Because you got to assume if you haven't been paid for something and they cancel, you're not getting paid for anything on top of that, most likely.
That's a good assumption. Okay, is there anything else about termination fees that we need to understand?
No, I mean, I think, it's a big one. Most of the disputes we have surround termination. We'll talk about, force majeure clauses and pandemic considerations in the next slide. But the general piece of advice we give to clients is the nice thing about signing a contract that's very specific up front is that you're locking your customer into those terms. If they want to change things at the last minute, and they often do, it's up to you whether you want to honor those or not. Right. And if they don't want to honor and say, all right, I don't want to do this date anymore, can you do another date? And you say, no, I can't do that date. A lot of clients, on the host side think, oh, well, you're canceling. Not in reality. Actually, they're canceling because they're not honoring the contract as it was written. They're not entitled to those changes. So that's why, coming up with a termination fee schedule, right? And contingencies for termination. It's not just if they say, look, the event's not happening. It's if they're saying the event is not happening in the way we contracted.
Okay. Let's go to the next slide, please. Force majeure and COVID-19. Force majeure is an act of God. COVID-19, we know what that is. And so you're saying that an act of God is not a termination, right? Meaning that the client can't terminate because a hurricane comes.
Right. A force majeure is an excuse for non-performance, but it's not an automatic I'm out of this contract. Right. So if you have a wedding scheduled and a hurricane comes in, the client can't just say, oh, I don't owe you any money on this because force majeure and I'm out of the contract. Not necessarily. Right. Courts are very reluctant to look at a force majeure clause, which typically exists in all contracts, not just catering or event agreements. It's a way to prevent somebody from suing you for not doing something, but it's not a way to unwind the contract completely in all cases. Right. So if there's a hurricane and you can't cater an event because you just physically can't do it, they can't sue you for non-performance of that, because you can say, look, there was literally no possible way I could have done that. Right. That's what the force majeure clause says. It doesn't say, okay, so we're not going to reschedule. We're not going to try to make this work. Right. So a force majeure clause might get you out of that specific obligation. But it's not, as a lot of clients assume, it's not a get out of jail free. Right. It's like, oh, COVID happened, so I don't need to pay you anything. No, COVID happened, so you couldn't have the event on this specific date. But generally, the parties in a situation like that have an obligation to try to work together to come up with alternative arrangements, a new date. So keep that in mind. I think force majeure is a concept that is frequently misunderstood. And it's one of those boilerplate clauses nobody really paid much attention to until the pandemic. The pandemic really shed light on what force majeure means. What are the parties' right to a situation where an event is scheduled 3 years out and the pandemic happens and now it can't happen, right? Do you owe all the money back? Do you owe some of the money back? Can either party get out of that? What happens?
Here's a question for you from Matthew. With the increase of extreme weather events, have the details of how force majeure is structured changed? For us up in the Catskills, extreme weather is the new normal, which is so true.
Mm-hmm. The bar for force majeure is very, very high, right? Force majeure is not a question of convenience. It's a question of impossibility. So if you have a wedding and it's raining, that's not force majeure. You can theoretically still have that wedding, right? You might move some things around, you might adjust some details, but it's not necessarily impossible. So
what if the governor declares a state of emergency in the state and says stay off the roads?
Then that would be a force majeure event, because it's now impossible to actually legally comply with your obligations under that contract. So that would flip it a little bit. If in a force majeure event, if something happens, what we include in our contracts is a requirement that the parties come together and try to reschedule the event, right? Because it's nobody's fault, but it also shouldn't justify canceling the event completely. And if the customer doesn't want to reschedule or doesn't want to work with you to do that, then it's a termination on their part. That's what we try to do. A lot of times, what the contract says and what you wind up enforcing depends on your relationship with that customer, right? A lot of times, our caterers or hosts go a little easier on the client than the contract might otherwise require, because we're all human beings and we want to, generate goodwill. Yeah. But our contracts try to protect caterers and hosts as much as possible to say, look, if there's a force majeure event, okay, we'll try to reschedule. If you don't want to do that, though, then we're looking at the termination schedule that we already put together.
Let's talk about that for a second. We're always trying to shift the risk from us as the operator and the caterer to the client. Now, so something happens and there's a torrential rains and it's a force majeure event, and then we're trying to find another day. I have a couple of questions. One, are we charging extra to move the date? Because it may actually cost us more money. We've rented things, we've done a lot to have this event on Saturday. Now we have to do it in 2 weeks. Can we charge for a rescheduling due to force majeure?
In a perfect world, yes. If the contract says you can do that, you can do that. It's harder to message, right? Because you got to think about where the host is coming from. If there's a wedding and they have so much on their mind, the idea of paying additional fees for something that's not their fault, it's a tough pill to swallow. So sometimes do it. It's it's harder to charge and impose than you might think in a vacuum, because if there's a force majeure event, the people who are ultimately holding that event probably are extremely stressed, extremely nervous, and more often than not, I think our clients try to work with them in that case. And if they eat a little bit of cost, that's okay, as long as they get paid ultimately. Can you charge a rescheduling fee for force majeure? Sure. It's a little harder to justify though, because it's really not the client's fault.
Got it. Okay. What's the last slide? Use of space. Let's talk about that. So there's two spaces. It's either our space that we control, or we're going to a third-party space. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, this is more talking about, yes, where the space actually is, but making sure that if you are, let's say you have a lease, right, and it's a private buyout of your space. If your lease has restrictions on what they can do or what you can do, make sure those restrictions are included in the event contract, right? If your lease or if your liquor license steps say no music beyond a certain time, or no live DJ, or you can't use the space for X, Y, and Z, make sure those restrictions are clearly outlined in your contract. If you're ultimately hosting at your space and clients are bringing decorations or want you to hang things, make sure you're putting any costs associated with any damages there onto the client beyond reasonable wear and tear. And you might consider saying, look, no decorations, sorry, or any decorations have to be approved by us because we have a very specific aesthetic. We're not bolting things to the walls. So use of space is more important when you are actually hosting at a space you control. It's less important if you're catering at somebody else's space, because it's generally a problem. But you want to make sure you're aware of any restrictions in your lease or in the venue's lease. We've seen situations where caterers are setting up at a space that they're unfamiliar with, and they learn while they're there, oh wait, there are restrictions on what we can do in this area, or we can't serve this area, or we can't serve liquor in this area. Just make sure you know what those restrictions are so you can plan accordingly.
Here's a question for you. If we're anticipating to be hosting a series of events, what language can we put in the contract that future events will follow the same terms in this contract? Or should we issue a new contract for every event with a frequently returning event organizer?
Ideally, new contract for every event. I would only schedule a series. I would only have one contract, schedule a series of events if you know in advance all of the terms of those series of events. It's harder if you have one contract govern all those events, because what happens if you do 2 out of the 3, but you can't do the third one? Does the whole contract terminate at that point? And do you recover, what money do you recover for one versus another? It's always safer to have a separate contract for each one. And the way you message that is to just say, look, we'll do 6 events. We'll have you sign the same contract. It's going to be the same. If there are any differences, just highlight those for the clients, send it to them for e-signature, and generally it's fine. But you never know, right? You might do 4 events and the 5th one's totally different and you need new language for that one.
Right. That makes sense. Anything else you want to say about use of space?
That's about it. Just make sure that you not only understand any lease restrictions, but if you are catering at a space that has a liquor license, or if you have a liquor license, make sure you understand what those restrictions are, because it's not just limitations in the lease, it could be limitations from the SLA as well. So getting ahead of those is really important.
Next slide, please, Alex. Guest conduct. Reserve the right to remove guests who, what do you mean by a security risk? You mean people who are doing any illegal activity like drugs, or that they're drunk?
Yeah, particularly if it's your space, right? If it's your restaurant or your catering hall, whatever it is, and somebody threw a punch, you should reserve the right to remove them. That goes without saying, right? But having it in the contract just helps add an extra layer of protection. But it's not necessarily something as robust as that. If somebody starts heckling or harassing or creating a situation where somebody's uncomfortable, right? You want to reserve the right to remove guests who are disrupting the peace, right? And in some kind of objectifiable way. The same, an extension of that is making sure you have the right to not serve people who are visibly intoxicated, but also maybe eject people who are intoxicated and who are presenting a perceived threat, right, to you, to the space, damaging property, whatever the case. That would really be the case by default, but having it in your event or catering contract is a really good thing. I would really only be concerned about this if you were ultimately hosting the event. If you're catering at a third party space, the only thing you really have to worry about is making sure it's clear you're going to ID people who you're serving, and you have the right to refuse service to people who are visibly intoxicated.
Great. Last slide, I think, Alex. Oh, maybe one more. Limiting liability. When you're talking about liability, you mean if something goes down at the event, we as the caterer, as the host, don't want to be held responsible. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, we just want to basically put a ceiling on a worst case scenario, right? So we'll impose a cap on liability. If there's, you know, a lawsuit against you, try to cap the total liability at the amount that you're charging under the contract. Make sure it's clear nobody can sue you personally. Any suits against the business would be against the business, and there's no veil piercing there. Try to avoid unnecessary warranties, right? Making sure it's clear, look, you're accepting this as is. You want third-party protection in the event that there's a slip and fall at your space, you're the caterer and you're not ultimately controlling it. Make sure you're indemnified by the host, right, in that case. Because in the event of an accident, they're going to sue everybody and anybody under the sun, regardless of whether you're responsible for it, right? Regardless of even whether it's your space. So you just want to make sure that these are more legalese type protections, but we're just letting you know as lawyers what our kind of mental checklist has in it when we're looking at existing contracts and trying to protect you as much as possible.
And let's let everybody know how this usually works, so people don't think that they have to go to law school to write a contract. Our clients hire us to write a contract, and then they take that contract and they use it for all of their events. Is that right?
For the most part, absolutely. We will create a template for them generally, and then we'll say, look, if there are any nuances or deviations event to event, let us know. And they'll say, look, this is our template, you prepared it. There's some unique aspects of this event. Can you take what you already prepared and tweak it to align with these needs? And we'll say, absolutely. And instead of, you know, reinventing the wheel each time, we'll have a standardized contract and we'll just make tweaks to it based on the specific circumstances if there are any differences. Another thing that isn't in this slide that I do want to mention is make sure you're requiring guests to disclose any dietary restrictions or allergies up front, right? So if the client knows that they're inviting somebody with a deadly peanut allergy, you got to know that, right? That's another reason why disclosing a sample menu is important. If somebody is deathly allergic to shellfish and you're giving them a menu with 3 shellfish items on it, it's kind of on them. Right. Yeah. And they can't say, oh, it's your fault. Then, you know, you say, well, no, we asked you to disclose to us any dietary restrictions. You didn't. It's clear we were planning to serve this thing. You didn't let us know. So it's not ultimately on us.
Next slide, please, Alex. Oh, good. Q&A. We've got a couple right on time. Ready, Andrew? We're 20 older venue. What is the, what if a guest wants to bring an underage guest? Should we request a waiver?
That's a good question. If you're 21 and over, the contract should explicitly state that no guests under the age of 21 are allowed on the premises, right? That should be in the contract. If you want to make an exception for that, then yeah, some kind of waiver. It puts you on notice though, not to serve that person, right? So if you do accept, like, you know, if your staff is used to assuming everybody's of age, they're not going to card. But if you have someone who you know is under 21 and you're allowing that to happen, make sure you're requiring the client to tell you exactly who that is, right?
The same person says that they have experienced guests who have ordered drinks for underage people. That's why we allow you to kick people out, right?
Yeah, you allow them to kick people out. I mean, you know, to be honest, if somebody does that, it's not even necessarily on the person serving unless it's really conspicuous, right? If I give you my ID and I'm 33 years old and I just start funneling drinks to my cousin who's 7, you're serving me legally. It's on me to do that. Unless there's some reason you know I'm doing that, or unless I'm doing that kind of in your view, that's not really on you. You're not doing anything wrong by serving me. If I come up and I'm at the bar every 5 minutes ordering drinks, maybe that's a tip off and maybe, you know, you ask some questions, but until something becomes very conspicuous or you're made aware of that, it's kind of not your problem unless they're doing it in plain sight.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you all for attending. If you have any follow-up questions, and I know some of you do, that are a little bit more specific, you can email Andrew at andrew.fine@helbraunlevey.com. He will answer however many questions he can. And thank you all for attending. This was a great attendance. It was great questions. Andrew, always great information. Really appreciate it. And we appreciate everybody stopping by. Thanks so much. Enjoy this beautiful day, everybody. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.